Call the police. He's stealing my car. The scream cut through the late afternoon air like a snapped wire, sharp enough to make conversation stop mid-sentence and heads turn in perfect unison. The parking lot of Hale Tower, 20 stories of mirrored glass and quiet power, fell into a strange, suspended silence, the kind that hums just beneath the surface before something breaks. A silver Rolls-Royce Phantom sat gleaming under the pale sunlight, its polished hood reflecting the sky like still water, untouched, immaculate, expensive in a way that didn't need to announce itself. And beside it stood Marcus Reed. He didn't move. Not when the words hit him. Not when heels clicked sharply against the pavement behind him. Not even when a phone lifted somewhere in the crowd. The subtle shift of someone deciding this moment was worth recording. Marcus just stood there, one hand loosely holding the key fob, the other resting at his side, calm in a way that didn't match the accusation hanging in the air. Victoria Hale approached like she owned not just the building, not just the car, but the moment itself. Her white coat caught the light with every step, tailored lines sharp against the wind, sunglasses hiding her eyes, but not the tension in her jaw. "Don't you dare touch that vehicle," she said, voice lower now, but no less cutting, the kind of tone that expected obedience before explanation. A few people shifted, glancing between them, measuring, deciding. Marcus finally turned his head, just slightly, enough to acknowledge her presence, but not enough to concede anything. His expression didn't change. No anger, no fear, just stillness, the kind that unsettled people who were used to reactions. "Ma'am," he said, quiet, even, like he was discussing something ordinary. "You might want to check." "I don't need to check anything," she cut in, stepping closer, the scent of expensive perfume trailing behind her like a signature. "I know exactly what I'm looking at." A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had formed, subtle but undeniable. Someone whispered. Someone laughed under their breath. Someone else angled their phone a little higher. The Rolls-Royce sat between them like a line drawn in chrome and silence. Marcus glanced at it for half a second, not admiring, not claiming, just recognizing. Then back to her. "You're making a mistake," he said. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't pleading. It was simple, matter of fact. And that, more than anything, seemed to irritate her. Victoria reached forward, her hand snapping out faster than expected, not violent, but decisive, grabbing the key fob from his fingers with a sharp, practiced motion. "People like you always say that," she replied, her voice carrying now, loud enough for the circle of onlookers to hear clearly. "Right before the truth comes out." The words hung there, heavier than they should have been, not because of what they said, but because of what they implied. Marcus looked at his now empty hand for a brief moment, then back at her. Still calm, still steady. Around them, the air felt tighter, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees without warning. Somewhere in the distance, faint but growing louder, a siren began to rise. Victoria didn't flinch. If anything, her posture straightened, her shoulders settling into certainty. "I already called," she said, almost casually, as if mentioning a dinner reservation. "We'll let them sort it out." Marcus exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in patience, like someone who had seen this exact moment play out before in a different form. He glanced briefly at the building behind her, the towering glass reflecting both of them back in distorted fragments, her sharp and bright, him steady and grounded. Then he looked back at her. "All right," he said. "Just that. No argument. No raised voice." The siren grew louder, closer now, bouncing off the concrete and steel around them until it filled the space completely. A black and white cruiser turned into the lot, tires rolling slow, deliberate, like it had nowhere else to be. Conversation stopped entirely this time. Phones lifted higher. The performance had entered its next act. The officer stepped out, one hand resting lightly on his belt, scanning the scene with practiced neutrality. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, voice calm, controlled. Victoria didn't hesitate. "That man," she said, pointing directly at Marcus without looking away from the officer, "was trying to take my car." The officer's gaze shifted to Marcus, measuring, assessing, waiting. Marcus met his eyes, steady, unshaken. For a brief second, the entire lot held its breath. The officer took a step closer. "Sir," he said, "I'm going to need you to come with me and explain what's going on." Marcus nodded once. No resistance. No hesitation. Just compliance wrapped in quiet confidence. As he took a step forward, the sunlight caught the side of the Rolls-Royce again, casting a clean, bright reflection across the ground. One that briefly illuminated his shoes, polished but worn, standing firmly on asphalt that suddenly felt like a stage. Victoria watched him, chin slightly raised, certain in a way that didn't leave room for doubt. But there was something else now, just beneath it. Something small. Something she didn't recognize yet. And Marcus, as he walked past her, paused just long enough to speak, his voice low, meant only for her, calm as ever. You really should have checked first. The officer's radio crackled softly at his shoulder, a low murmur of static and distant voices that blended into the background as he studied Marcus more closely, eyes moving from his posture to his hands to the calm way he stood, as if none of this was unusual, as if being accused in front of a growing crowd was just another moment to pass through. Do you have any identification on you, sir? The officer asked, his tone measured, not aggressive but firm enough to signal expectation. Marcus nodded once and reached slowly into his back pocket, careful, deliberate, the kind of movement that said he understood how quickly situations like this could turn if misread, and he handed over a slim leather wallet without a word. The officer flipped it open, scanning the contents, his expression unchanged at first, professional, detached, until his eyes paused for just a fraction of a second longer than before, a subtle shift that would have gone unnoticed by most, but not by Marcus. Around them, the crowd leaned in slightly, curiosity tightening the space, the faint hum of whispered assumptions filling the air like a low current. Victoria crossed her arms, the key fob still in her hand, tapping lightly against her palm in a rhythm that suggested impatience rather than doubt. You will find that everything checks out on my end, she said, her voice cool, controlled, directed more at the officer than at Marcus, as if the outcome had already been decided and this was just a formality. The officer glanced at her briefly, then back down at the identification, then back at Marcus. Mr. Reed, he said, testing the name, watching for a reaction that never came. Marcus simply nodded again, his gaze steady, his breathing even. The officer shifted his weight slightly, then gestured toward the Rolls-Royce. And this vehicle, you are saying it belongs to you? There was no accusation in the question, only procedure, but the words landed differently in the charged air of the moment. Victoria let out a short, incredulous laugh, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the quiet. He is not saying anything, she interjected quickly. He was caught with the key. That is what matters. Marcus turned his head just enough to look at her again, not confrontational, not defensive, just present. I said you should check, he replied calmly, his voice low but clear enough to carry. The officer raised a hand slightly, a subtle signal for patience, then stepped toward the car, the sunlight reflecting off its surface and casting a clean, bright glare across his uniform. He circled it slowly, taking in the details, the license plate, the condition, the absence of anything that looked out of place. When he reached the driver's side, he paused, glancing back at Marcus. Mind if he asked. Marcus shook his head once. Go ahead. The officer extended his hand. The key, ma'am. Victoria hesitated, just for a moment, her fingers tightening slightly around the fob before she handed it over, her expression unchanged but her movements a fraction less certain than before. The officer unlocked the car, the soft click echoing louder than it should have in the quiet lot, then opened the driver's door and leaned inside, his hand moving toward the dashboard controls. The interior lit up with a subtle glow, digital displays coming to life in smooth, silent precision. He waited, watching as the system initialized, then pressed a button, bringing up the vehicle information screen. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Just the faint hum of electronics and the distant sound of traffic beyond the building. Then the display shifted. Text appeared. Clean. Clear. Registered owner information scrolling into view. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly as he read, his posture changing in a way that was almost imperceptible but carried weight. He straightened slowly, stepping back from the car, the door still open behind him, and looked first at Marcus, then at Victoria. The silence that followed was different now. Not tense, not anticipatory. Something else. Something heavier. Ma'am, he said carefully, choosing his words with precision. Can you explain your relationship to this vehicle? Victoria blinked. Once, the question landing in a space she had not prepared for. It is mine, she said immediately, the confidence returning to her voice, though now it carried a faint edge. It is registered under my company. The officer held her gaze for a moment longer than before, then glanced back at Marcus. Marcus did not move, did not speak. He simply watched, the same calm stillness settling around him like it belonged there. The officer exhaled slowly, then closed the car door with a soft, controlled motion. The registration does list a company, he said, his tone neutral, but there was something underneath it now, something that had shifted. Victoria lifted her chin slightly, as if that confirmed everything she had said. Exactly, she replied. Hale Enterprises. The officer nodded once, then paused, just long enough for the air to tighten again, for the crowd to lean in without realizing it. Yes, ma'am, he said. Hale Enterprises. He looked back at Marcus. But the ownership of that company. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to, because in that moment, something invisible moved through the space between them, something that changed the balance without a single raised voice. And for the first time since she had spoken, Victoria's hand stopped tapping the key fob entirely. The officer did not rush his words, and that pause stretched just long enough to pull every eye in the parking lot toward him, as if the answer he had not yet spoken was already reshaping the space around them. And Marcus could feel it without moving, the subtle shift in weight, in breath, in expectation. The ownership of that company, the officer continued finally, his voice steady but quieter now, is not listed under Hale. The name seemed to land heavier than it should have, like something misplaced being returned to its proper place. Victoria's expression did not change immediately, but something behind her sunglasses tightened, a small hesitation that broke the rhythm she had been holding onto since the beginning. That is not possible, she said, her voice controlled, but now carrying a thin edge that had not been there before. The officer did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply turned the dashboard display slightly, so it faced outward, just enough for her to see, for the truth to exist in the open rather than behind his words. The screen glowed softly in the afternoon light, the text sharp and unmistakable. Registered to Reed Holdings Group. The name sat there without explanation, without emotion, without urgency. Just fact. Marcus did not look at the screen. He did not need to. He watched Victoria instead, the way her posture held for 1 second too long before adjusting. The way her grip tightened slightly at her side where the key fob had been moments ago, the way certainty began to fracture not all at once, but in quiet, precise lines. Around them, the crowd shifted again, but this time the energy was different, less confident, more curious, as if the story they had already decided on was slipping away from them. Someone lowered their phone. Someone else leaned closer. The officer stepped back from the vehicle and closed the door gently, the soft click sounding final in a way that cut through the tension. Ma'am, he said, his tone still respectful but no longer aligned with her certainty. This vehicle is registered under Reed Holdings Group, and according to our database, that entity is the parent company of Hale Enterprises. The words were simple, structured, impossible to misunderstand. Victoria let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but it did not carry the same sharpness as before. That does not make any sense, she said, more to herself now than to anyone else. I would know if my company had changed ownership. Marcus finally spoke, his voice quiet, steady, carrying just enough to reach her without forcing its way into the moment. You would know, he said, if you had been paying attention. It was not an accusation. It was not loud, but it landed with more weight than anything that had been said so far. The officer glanced between them, sensing that whatever was unfolding no longer required his direction, only his presence. Victoria turned toward Marcus fully now, her sunglasses still in place, but her focus no longer distant, no longer dismissive. Who are you? She asked, the question slipping out before she could reshape it into something stronger. Marcus held her gaze for a moment, then reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a thin, folded document, not rushed, not dramatic, just another step in a sequence that had already been set in motion long before this moment. He unfolded it carefully and handed it to the officer, who accepted it and scanned the top line, his brows lifting slightly before he turned it outward for Victoria to see. Acquisition confirmation. Reed Holdings Group. Hale Enterprises. Effective date. 6 months ago. The paper did not move. The wind did not touch it. It existed in that space like a fixed point that everything else had to adjust around. Victoria's hand lifted slowly, not to take the document, but as if to steady something unseen. No, she said, barely above a whisper now. That would have required board approval. Legal notice. There are processes. Marcus nodded once. There were, he said. All of them. The officer cleared his throat lightly, not interrupting, just marking his presence again. Ma'am, based on what I am seeing, there is no indication of theft here. The statement was formal, but its impact was immediate. The word theft, which had dominated the moment minutes ago, now felt misplaced, almost distant. Victoria lowered her hand slowly, the absence of the key fob suddenly more noticeable than before. For the first time, she looked at Marcus not as a disruption, not as a problem to be resolved, but as something she did not understand. Why? She asked, the single word carrying more weight than all her earlier certainty. Marcus considered her for a moment, then glanced briefly at the building behind her, the mirrored glass reflecting both of them again, but differently now, less distorted, more aligned. Because you signed it, he said. The words were calm, precise, and final in a way that did not need emphasis. Victoria's breath caught, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough for the silence around them to deepen. The officer stepped back slightly, giving space, recognizing that whatever had begun in accusation was ending in realization. And Marcus, standing where he had been from the beginning, did not move, did not claim victory, did not change his tone. He simply waited, as the truth settled into place around them, quiet and unavoidable. The word lingered in the air longer than it should have, as if it refused to move forward with the rest of time, and Victoria felt it settle somewhere deeper than the moment itself, not as a sound, but as recognition that arrived too late to stop anything. Because you signed it. Marcus did not repeat himself, and he did not need to, because the memory was already finding its way back to her, not all at once, but in fragments that began to align with a quiet precision she could not ignore. A conference room 12 floors up, late evening light pressing against the glass walls. A stack of documents she had skimmed between calls, trusting the structure more than the substance. She could almost hear her own voice again, sharp, efficient, dismissing a junior analyst who had hesitated over one clause. It is standard language, she had said then, her pen already moving. The crowd around them shifted again, but more slowly now, less certain of what they were witnessing, as if the story had slipped beyond easy judgment and into something they had to reconsider. The officer remained still, no longer the center of the moment, just a witness to its outcome, his earlier authority replaced by a quiet awareness that this was no longer about procedure. Victoria lowered her sunglasses slowly, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a necessity, as if she needed to see clearly now, without the distance they had always given her. Her eyes met Marcus's fully for the first time, and there was no recognition there, only the absence of it, the realization that she had never truly seen him before this moment, not in the building, not in the reports, not in the decisions that carried his name, without ever reaching his face. That document, she said carefully, her voice no longer sharp but controlled in a different way, as if she was choosing each word with more caution than before. It was part of a restructuring package. Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the accuracy without conceding anything else. It was, he replied, one you approved. The simplicity of it pressed in around her, stripping away the layers she usually relied on to navigate situations like this. She looked back at the Rolls-Royce for a brief moment, the reflection on its surface no longer just light and shape, but something more exact, something that mirrored the imbalance she had just been standing in without realizing it. You are saying, she continued, slower now, that you acquired controlling interest through that agreement. Marcus did not step closer. He did not shift his stance. He simply answered, I am saying it already happened. The officer glanced at the document again, then at Victoria, then back at Marcus, as if confirming that what he was hearing matched what he had read, and everything aligned too cleanly to question. Ma'am, he said gently, there is nothing here that suggests any unlawful activity on his part. The phrasing was careful, But the meaning was clear, and the earlier accusation now felt distant, almost misplaced in the reality that had replaced it. Victoria inhaled slowly, steadying herself, but the breath did not restore the control she had started with. Instead, it revealed the absence of it. Around them, a few people began to step back, the tension no longer pulling them in, but releasing them, as if the moment had shifted from spectacle to something quieter, something more personal. A man lowered his phone completely. A woman turned away, shaking her head slightly, not in judgment, but in recognition of how quickly certainty could collapse. Marcus watched all of it without reacting, his attention returning to Victoria only when she spoke again. "Why did I not know?" she asked, the question directed at him now. Not the officer, not the crowd, but the one person who had been present in ways she had not understood. Marcus considered her for a moment, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of still clarity that had been there from the beginning. "Because you did not read it," he said. There was no emphasis, no accusation, just fact. Victoria's jaw tightened slightly, not in defiance, but in acknowledgement of something she could not easily dismiss. The memory sharpened. The paragraph she had skipped. The language she had trusted without verifying. The name that had not meant anything at the time. Reed Holdings. It had been just another entity among many, just another line in a structure she believed she controlled. She let out a quiet breath, this one different, not steadying, but releasing something she could no longer hold in place. The officer stepped back another half step, creating space that had not existed before, recognizing that the situation had resolved itself without the need for further intervention. "If there is nothing else," he said, his tone neutral again, returning to procedure now that the imbalance had corrected, "I will be clearing the call." Victoria did not respond immediately. She was still looking at Marcus, still recalibrating something internal that had shifted too quickly to fully process. Marcus nodded once. Toward the officer. "Thank you," he said, his voice unchanged, as if this entire exchange had followed a path he had already understood. The officer returned the nod, then turned and walked back toward his cruiser, the sound of his steps fading into the larger quiet that had settled over the lot. Marcus stepped toward the car, reaching for the door handle with the same calm precision he had shown from the start, as if reclaiming something that had never truly been taken. He paused briefly, just long enough to look at Victoria one more time, not with triumph, not with resentment, but with something far quieter. "Next time," he said, "read the line you think does not matter." Then he opened the door, the soft sound of it echoing lightly against the glass building behind them, and for the first time since the moment began, the scene moved forward without resistance. The door closed with a soft, controlled sound, and for a moment the world seemed to hold itself in that exact position, as if even the air needed a second to catch up with what had just shifted. Marcus settled into the driver's seat without urgency, his movements smooth, practiced, familiar in a way that made the car feel less like a luxury and more like a tool he understood completely. The interior lights adjusted automatically, casting a quiet, warm glow across the dashboard, the system responding to him without hesitation, without question. Outside, Victoria stood exactly where she had been, but nothing about her posture carried the same authority anymore. Her shoulders were still straight, her stance still composed, but the certainty that had defined her presence minutes ago had thinned into something quieter, something less stable. She watched him through the glass, her reflection overlapping his for a brief moment, the contrast no longer as clear as it had been when this began. Marcus placed his hand lightly on the steering wheel, pausing before starting the engine, not because he needed time, but because he chose it, as if allowing the moment to settle fully before moving on. Around them, the last of the small crowd began to disperse, footsteps soft against the pavement, voices low, conversations shifting away from what had just happened as people returned to their own lives, carrying with them a version of the story that no longer fit the way it had at the start. A security guard near the entrance adjusted his stance, no longer watching Marcus, no longer aligning himself with Victoria, just another observer who had misread the moment and now quietly stepped back from it. The officer's cruiser pulled away slowly, its presence fading into the background. The official part of the situation concluded without ceremony. Victoria took a small step forward, not toward the car, but toward understanding, her hand lifting slightly as if to reach for something that was no longer there, then lowering again when she realized there was nothing left to hold on to. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice steady but different now, stripped of the sharp edge it once carried, shaped instead by something closer to restraint. Marcus glanced up, meeting her gaze through the open window, his expression unchanged, calm as it had been from the beginning, not softened, not hardened, simply present. "Yes," he replied. The single word settled between them, neutral, open, without invitation or rejection. Victoria hesitated for half a second, not out of uncertainty about what to say, but because the structure she usually relied on to say it no longer applied. "If what you are saying is accurate," she began, her tone shifting into something more formal, more measured, "then there are implications that extend beyond this situation." Marcus nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without engaging with its weight. "There are," he said. The engine started quietly beneath his hand, a low, refined hum that filled the space without overpowering it, the car responding as naturally as it had earlier when the officer accessed its system. Victoria watched the subtle shift, the confirmation of control, and something in her expression tightened again, not in denial, but in recognition of how complete that control actually was. "I would like to review the documentation," she continued, her voice steadying as she returned to language she understood, in a more formal setting. Marcus considered her for a moment, not dismissing the request, but not rushing to accommodate it either. "You already did," he said calmly. The words landed without force, but they carried a finality that made it clear this was not a negotiation of facts, only of consequences. Victoria exhaled slowly, the breath measured, controlled, but unable to restore what had been lost. She looked briefly at the building behind her, its mirrored surface reflecting the afternoon light. The same place where decisions had been made, signed, and filed away without full attention. When she looked back at Marcus, there was something different in her eyes, not submission, not apology, but awareness. "Then I will need to understand what comes next," she said. Marcus rested his hand lightly on the wheel, the car idling smoothly, ready to move but not yet in motion. "What comes next," he replied, "is what should have come first." The statement was simple, but it shifted the weight of the moment again, not back to where it started, but forward into something else, something less visible but more lasting. Victoria nodded once, slowly, absorbing the meaning without fully responding to it. The space between them no longer held accusation or defense, only the quiet presence of a reality that had revealed itself too late to be prevented. Marcus glanced ahead, then back at her one final time, not to confirm anything, not to emphasize his position, but to close the moment in the same calm way he had carried it from the beginning. "Good afternoon, Ms. Hale," he said, his tone even, respectful, unchanged by everything that had just unfolded. Then he shifted the car into drive, the movement smooth and unhurried, and the Rolls-Royce began to move forward, its tires rolling quietly over the pavement, leaving behind a space that felt different than it had before, not louder, not emptier, but clearer in a way that could not be undone. Victoria remained standing as the car passed, her reflection stretching briefly along its polished surface before disappearing entirely, and for the first time that day, she did not try to stop what was already moving beyond her control. The Rolls-Royce moved past the edge of the lot and onto the quiet street beyond, its engine barely audible, the city unfolding ahead in clean lines of glass and concrete. But Marcus did not accelerate immediately. He let the car glide, as if allowing the weight of the moment behind him to settle before fully leaving it behind. Inside, the cabin remained calm, insulated from the outside world, the soft hum of the engine blending with the faint sound of the climate system adjusting automatically, a controlled environment responding to his presence without question. His hands rested lightly on the wheel, steady, unhurried, his eyes forward but not distant, focused in a way that suggested he was not thinking about what had just happened, but about something that had been set in motion long before it. Behind him, in the reflection of the rearview mirror, Hale Tower grew smaller, its mirrored surface catching the late afternoon light. The same building that had once stood as a symbol of control, now reduced to a distant structure in a skyline that no longer held the same meaning. Marcus reached toward the center console and tapped a single control, the display shifting smoothly, bringing up a familiar interface, numbers, names, schedules aligned with quiet precision, everything in its place. He glanced at it briefly, then back to the road, as if confirming something already known. The city moved around him, traffic lights changing, pedestrians crossing, the rhythm of everyday life continuing without interruption, unaware of the shift that had just taken place in a small parking lot a few blocks away. A few minutes passed in silence before his phone vibrated softly against the console, a low, controlled buzz that did not startle him, only signaled timing. He tapped the screen once, accepting the call through the car's system. "Read," he said, his voice even, the same calm tone that had carried him through the entire encounter. A voice responded on the other end, measured, professional, carrying a slight urgency beneath its surface. "We saw the update come through," the voice said. "There has been internal movement at Hale Enterprises. Senior staff are requesting clarification." Marcus allowed a brief pause, not out of hesitation, but out of consideration, as if the response had already been decided and only needed the right moment to be delivered. "They will receive it," he said. "Not from me." The voice on the other end shifted slightly, processing. "Understood," it replied. "Do you want us to prepare a formal statement?" Marcus glanced at the road ahead, the light turning green, the car continuing forward without resistance. "No," he said simply. "They already have everything they need." The call ended without further discussion, the line going quiet as the system returned to its default display. Marcus rested his hand back on the wheel, his posture unchanged, his focus steady, as if nothing about the exchange required additional thought. Meanwhile, back at the tower, Victoria had not moved far from where she had been standing, the space around her now almost empty, the earlier crowd reduced to a few distant figures who no longer paid attention, the moment having lost its spectacle but not its impact. She stood facing the direction the car had gone, her sunglasses now lowered completely, held loosely in her hand, no longer serving their purpose. The silence around her felt different than before, not tense, not expectant, but reflective in a way that left no room for distraction. She turned slowly and walked toward the building entrance, her steps measured, controlled, but lacking the sharp authority they once carried. The glass doors opened automatically as she approached, the cool air inside meeting her as she crossed the threshold, the familiar environment waiting, unchanged on the surface, but already shifting beneath it. Inside, the lobby remained polished, quiet, the marble floors reflecting the overhead lights in clean lines, but there was a subtle difference now, a hesitation in the way people looked at her, a slight pause before returning to their work, as if something had already begun to circulate through the structure of the building. She moved toward the elevator without speaking, her reflection following her in the mirrored panels, no longer just an image of control, but something more complex, something that carried the weight of a realization still unfolding. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and she stepped inside, pressing the button for the executive floor, the number lighting up with a quiet confirmation. As the doors closed, the outside world disappeared, replaced by the confined stillness of the ascending space. She stood alone, the hum of the elevator barely noticeable, her mind moving through the fragments Marcus had left behind, the document, the clause, the signature, each piece aligning into a structure she could no longer deny. When the doors opened again, the hallway beyond was unchanged, the same polished surfaces, the same quiet offices, but the atmosphere felt different, as if the building itself had already adjusted to a new reality. Assistants looked up briefly as she passed, their expressions neutral but attentive, aware that something had shifted even if they did not yet understand how. Victoria walked into her office and closed the door behind her, the sound soft but final, sealing her into a space that had once been entirely hers. She moved toward her desk, her hand resting lightly on its surface, the familiar weight grounding her for a moment, before she reached for the stack of documents waiting there. Without hesitation, she began to flip through them, her movements precise, focused, searching not for confirmation, but for understanding, the lines of text now carrying a meaning she had overlooked before. And somewhere within those pages, between the language she had once dismissed and the signature she had placed without pause, The truth was no longer hidden. It was simply waiting to be read. The pages did not resist her this time. They did not blur into background noise or flatten into routine language the way they had before. Every line seemed sharper now, each clause holding weight it had always carried, but she had chosen not to feel. Victoria stood at her desk, one hand resting against the polished surface, the other moving steadily through the stack, page after page sliding beneath her fingers with a soft, controlled rhythm. The office around her remained quiet, the distant hum of the building continuing as if nothing had changed, but inside that room, everything had shifted into a different kind of clarity. She stopped on a page she did not remember reading fully before, her eyes tracing the paragraph slowly, deliberately this time, not skimming, not assuming, but absorbing. The language was precise, structured, hidden behind familiar legal phrasing that once felt routine. Now it read differently. Now it read like intention. Transfer of controlling interest upon execution. No escalation clause. No secondary confirmation required. Final upon signature. Her breath slowed, not out of calm, but out of focus, as if her body had adjusted to the weight of what she was finally seeing. She leaned slightly closer, her fingertips pressing lightly against the edge of the document, grounding herself in something physical as the realization continued to unfold. Reed Holdings Group. The name appeared again, not as a footnote, not as a background entity, but as the center of the structure she had approved. She closed her eyes briefly, not to escape it, but to align the memory with the text. The conference room returned, clearer now. The assistant who had hesitated. The question she had cut off before it was fully formed. It is standard language. She had said it without looking, without asking, without needing to. Or at least, that was what she had believed. A soft knock at the door interrupted the stillness, not loud, not urgent, just enough to mark that the outside world had begun to move again. Victoria did not respond immediately. She finished the line she was reading, her eyes holding on the final word, as if it might shift if she looked away too soon. It did not. It remained exactly as it had always been. "Come in," she said finally, her voice even, but quieter than usual. The door opened slowly, and Daniel stepped inside, his posture careful, his expression neutral but attentive, the kind of presence shaped by years of working within her expectations. He paused just inside the doorway, waiting, measuring the room before speaking. "There has been some internal communication," he said, his tone controlled, professional. "Several departments have received updated ownership notices." Victoria did not look up immediately. She turned one more page, then another, as if confirming the pattern, the consistency of what she had missed. "And?" she asked, still focused on the document. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because he did not have the answer, but because the answer no longer fit the structure they had both operated within. "They are requesting direction," he said. "From you." Victoria's hand stilled on the page. The word "from you" lingered differently now, not as authority, as question. She lifted her gaze slowly, meeting his eyes, and for the first time, there was no immediate response waiting behind it. Only assessment. Only recalibration. "They should follow the updated structure," she said, her voice steady, but stripped of its earlier certainty. Daniel nodded once, absorbing the shift without commenting on it. "Understood," he replied. He did not move to leave immediately. Instead, he remained where he was, as if there was something else that needed to be said, but no clear way to place it. Victoria noticed. "What is it?" she asked. Daniel chose his words carefully. "There is a meeting request," he said. "From Reed Holdings." The name settled into the room with quiet precision, not disruptive, but undeniable. Victoria held his gaze for a moment, then glanced back down at the document in front of her, the same name printed clearly across the top. It no longer felt like an external entity. It felt like something already inside her system, already reshaping it from within. "When?" she asked. "End of day," Daniel replied. Victoria nodded slowly, the motion small but deliberate. "Schedule it," she said. Daniel inclined his head slightly, then turned and exited the office, the door closing softly behind him, leaving her alone again with the pages that no longer allowed distance. She stood there for a moment longer, then gathered the documents into a single stack, aligning the edges with precise movements, restoring order to something that had never truly been disordered, only misunderstood. She placed the stack down carefully, her hand resting on top of it for a brief second, as if acknowledging the weight it now carried. Then she moved toward the window, the city stretching out below in clean, structured lines, traffic moving in steady patterns, unaware of the shift that had already taken place above them. Somewhere out there, Marcus was moving through that same city, not as an outsider, not as a disruption, but as something she had failed to recognize until it was too late to control. Victoria stood still, her reflection faint in the glass, no longer dominating the view, but existing within it, part of a larger frame she was only beginning to understand. And for the first time in a long time, she did not reach for control. She reached for clarity. The meeting request did not arrive with urgency, but it carried something heavier than urgency, something precise, something inevitable. And by the time the clock moved past 4 in the afternoon, the entire executive floor had shifted into a quieter rhythm, conversations shorter, footsteps softer, as if the building itself understood that something larger than routine was about to take place. Victoria stood at the long conference table, the same room where she had once signed without hesitation, now arranged with deliberate symmetry, folders aligned, chairs evenly spaced, water glasses untouched, and waiting, everything in place except certainty. The city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows had begun to dim, the sunlight softening into a cooler tone, reflecting off nearby buildings in muted gold and gray, the transition subtle but unmistakable, like the shift that had been unfolding since that morning. She adjusted one of the folders slightly, not because it needed it, but because the movement gave her a moment to steady her thoughts, to align herself with the version of this meeting she believed she could still control. The door opened quietly behind her, not rushed, not announced, just a smooth interruption of the silence, and when she turned, Marcus Reed stepped inside without hesitation, his presence calm, grounded, carrying none of the tension that had filled the parking lot earlier. He was dressed simply, the same understated precision, nothing about him demanding attention, and yet the room adjusted to him immediately, as if his presence defined the space without effort. He paused just inside the doorway, his eyes taking in the room, not evaluating, not judging, simply observing. Then he stepped forward at an unhurried pace, each movement aligned with a confidence that did not need to be displayed. Victoria watched him approach, her posture straight, her expression composed, but no longer built on assumption. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice controlled, measured, not cold, not warm, simply present. Marcus nodded once. "Ms. Hale," he replied, his tone even, matching hers without mirroring it. There was no handshake, no extended gesture, just acknowledgement, and that absence felt intentional, as if both of them understood that formality would not define what was about to happen. He took a seat at the far end of the table, not the head, not a position that claimed dominance, but one that aligned with perspective, giving him a clear view of the room, of her, of everything that mattered. Victoria remained standing for a moment longer, then sat across from him, the distance between them measured not in feet, but in what had already shifted. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but it was not empty either. It held weight, expectation, a pause before something necessary. Victoria reached for the folder in front of her and opened it slowly, her movements precise, intentional, as if every action needed to be grounded in clarity. "I reviewed the documentation," she began, her voice steady, the words chosen carefully, in full. Marcus inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without interrupting. "And," he asked, not pressing, not challenging, simply allowing the next step to come from her. Victoria's eyes moved briefly across the page, not because she needed to read it again, but because she understood now what it represented. "The transfer is valid," she said. The words were simple, direct, stripped of any attempt to reshape them. Marcus did not react immediately. He let the statement settle, not as confirmation for himself, but as something she needed to say fully before moving forward. "It always was," he replied quietly. Victoria looked up at him, meeting his gaze without the barrier she had carried before, and for a moment, there was no defense there, no strategy, only recognition. "You structured it carefully," she continued, not as an accusation, but as an observation. Marcus rested his hands lightly on the table, his posture unchanged. "I structured it clearly," he said. The distinction was small, but it shifted the meaning entirely. Victoria nodded once, absorbing it. The room remained still, the faint hum of the building almost imperceptible, the outside world distant behind the glass. "Then I need to understand your position," she said, her tone returning to something more formal, not out of habit, but out of necessity. "What you intend to do with Hale Enterprises." Marcus considered the question for a moment, not because he lacked an answer, but because the answer required more than a single statement. He glanced briefly at the window, at the city beyond, then back at her. "I intend to keep it exactly what it was meant to be," he said. Victoria's brow tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in focus. "And what is that?" she asked. Marcus's expression remained calm, but there was a subtle shift in his tone, something deeper, something that carried beyond business language. "A place where decisions are not made on assumptions," he said. The words landed without force, but they carried the weight of everything that had happened before this moment. Victoria held his gaze, the meaning settling in, not as a challenge, but as a reflection of something she had overlooked. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her hands resting on the table, no longer gripping the edges of control, but placed with intention. "Then we will need to restructure leadership alignment," she said, her voice steady again, but now built on something different, something closer to understanding. Marcus nodded once. "We will," he replied. The conversation did not escalate. It did not fracture. It moved forward, quiet, precise, each word placed carefully, not to win, not to defend, but to define what came next. And in that room, where control had once been assumed without question, something else began to take shape, something quieter, something stronger, something built not on who held power, but on who understood it. The room held its shape, but the air inside it had changed, not visibly, not dramatically, just enough that every word carried more weight than before, as if the space itself was now listening more carefully than it ever had. Victoria remained seated, her posture aligned, her hands resting lightly on the table, no longer gripping control, but holding position within it. And across from her, Marcus sat with the same quiet steadiness, not claiming authority, not displaying it, simply existing within it as if it had always been his. The documents between them remained untouched now, their purpose fulfilled, their presence no longer necessary to prove what had already been accepted. "There is one more thing," Victoria said after a brief pause, her voice measured, the words chosen with a precision that came not from habit, but from awareness. Marcus lifted his gaze slightly, giving her his full attention without shifting his posture. "Go on," he said. Victoria glanced briefly toward the window, the city outside now transitioning fully into evening, lights beginning to appear in distant buildings, small points of clarity in a growing darkness. "This morning," she continued, "in the parking lot." She did not finish the sentence immediately, not because she lacked the language, but because the language required acknowledgement she was not accustomed to giving. Marcus did not interrupt. He did not fill the silence. He allowed it to remain, as if it was part of what needed to be said. Victoria exhaled slowly, then continued. "I made an assumption." The words were simple, but they carried more weight than any structured statement she had made all day. Marcus watched her, not with judgment, not with validation, just with presence. "You did," he replied quietly. There was no softness added to it, but there was no sharpness either. Just recognition. Victoria nodded once, accepting the clarity without resistance. "It was not based on fact," she added, her voice steady, not defensive, not seeking to justify, only to define. Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair, a subtle shift that did not change his presence, but acknowledged the direction the conversation had taken. "No," he said. "It was not." The silence returned, but it felt different now, less about tension, more about space, the kind that allows something real to exist without being rushed. Victoria looked down briefly at the table, her reflection faint in its polished surface, then back up at him. "That is not how this company is supposed to operate," she said. Marcus's expression did not change, but something in his gaze sharpened slightly, not in confrontation, but in alignment. "It is not," he agreed. Victoria's fingers moved slightly against the table, a small, controlled motion, as if grounding herself in the moment. "Then it needs to change," she said. The statement was firm, but not forceful, built on understanding rather than assertion. Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the direction without claiming ownership of it. It already has, he replied. The distinction was subtle, but it shifted the weight again, from intention to reality. Victoria absorbed that, her posture remaining composed, but her presence now rooted in something different than before. Then I will need to adjust with it, she said. Marcus did not respond immediately. He studied her for a moment, not evaluating, not measuring, but recognizing something that had not been there earlier. That depends, he said finally. Victoria held his gaze. On what? She asked. Marcus's tone remained even, but there was a clarity in it now that cut through anything unnecessary. On whether you understand what actually changed, he said. The question did not sound like a challenge, but it carried the weight of one. Victoria did not answer right away. She looked toward the window again, the city now fully lit, each light distinct, each one part of a larger structure that functioned because each part was seen, acknowledged, accounted for. When she spoke, her voice was quieter, but more certain. Control is not the same as understanding, she said. Marcus's gaze held steady on her, and for the first time, there was a subtle shift in his expression, not approval, not satisfaction, but recognition. No, he said. It is not. The room remained still, the conversation no longer moving in sharp turns, but in steady alignment, each word building on the last without needing to push forward. Victoria straightened slightly in her chair, not to reassert authority, but to meet the moment with clarity. Then I intend to understand it, she said. Marcus considered her for a brief moment, then nodded once, the motion small but definitive. That is where it starts, he replied. The words settled into the space between them, not as an ending, but as a beginning that did not need to be announced. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, lights steady, movement constant, unaware of the shift that had taken place inside a quiet room. Above it, and inside that room, where assumptions had once moved faster than understanding, something else now held the space, something quieter, something stronger, something that did not need to prove itself to exist. The words remained in the room long after they were spoken, not echoing, not repeating, but settling into the space between them like something that could not be undone once understood. Marcus leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, not in a gesture of control, but of presence, as if what came next required more than distance. Victoria watched him closely, her posture still composed, but no longer guarded in the same way, her focus sharpened by the realization that this conversation was no longer about position, but about consequence. Understanding is not something you declare, Marcus said, his voice calm, measured, carrying the same quiet authority it had from the beginning. It is something you demonstrate. Victoria did not respond immediately. Her eyes moved briefly across the table, the polished surface reflecting both of them in faint outlines, no longer divided by assumption, but connected by what had already unfolded. Then tell me what that looks like, she said finally, her tone steady, not defensive, not demanding, but direct. Marcus considered her for a moment, not because the answer was unclear, but because the answer required precision. It starts with what you do when no one is watching, he said. The statement did not rise in volume, but it carried a weight that shifted the room again, from discussion into reflection. Victoria held his gaze, absorbing the meaning without interrupting. Marcus continued, his tone unchanged. This morning, there were people watching, he said. You did not need to think. You reacted. Victoria's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition of the truth in the statement. She did not look away. And now? She asked quietly. Marcus leaned back again, returning to stillness. Now there is no audience, he said. So the decision is yours. The silence that followed was not empty. It was active, filled with the weight of choice, of what came next not being defined by what had happened, but by how it was understood. Victoria shifted slightly in her chair, not out of discomfort, but to align herself with the moment more fully. Her hands moved from resting to placing, fingers interlaced lightly on the table, a posture that held intention rather than control. Then I will begin with the structure, she said, her voice steady, grounded. Internal review of decision protocols. Mandatory verification on all executive approvals. No assumption-based authorization. Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the direction without interrupting. That addresses process, he said, not perspective. The distinction was immediate. Victoria absorbed it, her expression tightening slightly, not in frustration, but in concentration. Then perspective changes with accountability, she replied. Marcus's gaze remained steady. Accountability to what? He asked. Victoria paused, not because she lacked an answer, but because the answer required more than instinct. She looked briefly toward the window again, the city lights now steady, each one distinct, each one part of a system that functioned because it was seen, because it was acknowledged. When she spoke again, her voice carried something new, something quieter but more certain. To reality, she said. Marcus did not respond immediately. He let the words settle, measuring not its sound, but its meaning. Then he nodded once. That is closer, he said. The room remained still, the conversation no longer sharp, no longer reactive, but deliberate, each word placed with care, each response building on what had already been understood. Victoria exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, but no longer used to maintain authority. Instead, it marked a shift inward, a recalibration of something deeper than process. This company was built on control, she said, not as a defense, but as an acknowledgement. Marcus inclined his head slightly. Most are, he replied. Victoria's gaze held steady. Then it will need to be rebuilt on awareness, she said. Marcus's expression did not change, but something in his posture settled, as if the statement aligned with something already in motion. That takes time, he said. And consistency. Victoria nodded once. Then it starts now, she replied. The words did not carry urgency. They carried decision. Marcus studied her for a moment longer, not evaluating, not testing, but recognizing the difference between intention and action, between statement and direction. Then the first step is simple, he said. Victoria waited. You do not lead this change alone, he continued. The statement shifted the dynamic again, not removing her from it, but redefining her place within it. Victoria's brow tightened slightly, not in disagreement, but in recalibration. Then who does? She asked. Marcus met her gaze directly. The people who were never in the room. When decisions were made, he said. The words landed with quiet precision, reshaping the space between them once more. Victoria did not respond immediately. She considered it, not dismissing it, not resisting it, but allowing it to expand beyond the structure she had always known. The room remained silent, but it was no longer heavy. It was open. Outside, the city continued its steady rhythm, lights unwavering, movement constant, unaware of the shift taking place above it. And inside that room, where control had once defined everything, something else now began to take hold, something less visible, but far more lasting, something that did not demand attention, but changed everything once it was understood. The room did not shift, but something inside it deepened, as if the foundation beneath every word had moved just enough to change what could be built on top of it. Victoria remained still, her gaze fixed on Marcus, not searching for advantage anymore, not measuring responses, but listening in a way she had not practiced before. The idea he had placed between them did not fade. It expanded. The people who were never in the room, she repeated quietly, not as a question, but as something she needed to hear again in her own voice. Marcus did not nod this time. He did not confirm it. He simply watched her, allowing the meaning to take shape without interference. Victoria leaned back slightly in her chair, her hands loosening where they had been interlaced, resting now with a kind of openness that did not belong to her earlier posture. You are suggesting structural inclusion, she said, returning briefly to the language she understood, but the tone beneath it had changed, less clinical, more aware. Marcus shook his head once, a small movement, but precise. I am suggesting you stop excluding without realizing it, he replied. The distinction landed immediately, sharper than the phrasing she had chosen, not because it was louder, but because it was clearer. Victoria absorbed it, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in resistance, but in focus. Then the system itself is flawed, she said. Marcus tilted his head slightly. It always was, he answered. The simplicity of it removed any space for debate. The system had not broken. It had revealed itself. Victoria exhaled slowly, the breath measured, controlled, but this time it did not carry tension. It carried acknowledgement. She looked down. at the table for a moment, her reflection faint beneath her, then back up at him. Then I have been operating inside a structure I did not fully understand, she said. Marcus held her gaze. You were operating inside a structure that worked for you, he said. That is not the same thing. The words settled into the space between them with quiet precision, not accusatory, not softened, just true. Victoria nodded once, the movement small but deliberate. No, she said. It is not. The room remained still, but the silence no longer pressed in. It held space. Victoria shifted forward slightly, placing both hands flat against the table, grounding herself not in control, but in presence. Then I need to hear from them, she said. Marcus watched her carefully now, not testing, but recognizing the direction of her thought. Not filtered, she added. Not summarized. Direct. Marcus nodded once, the first clear affirmation since the idea had been introduced. That is where understanding begins, he said. Victoria's gaze remained steady. Then I will set it up, she said. Cross-level review. Open sessions. No hierarchy in the room. Marcus's expression did not change, but something in his posture settled again, as if the structure she was describing aligned with something already in motion. And when they speak, he asked. Victoria did not hesitate this time. I listened, she said. Marcus held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. A motion that carried more weight than agreement. It carried recognition. The conversation did not rise. It did not fracture. It continued in the same measured rhythm, each word placed carefully, each response grounded in something that had not existed when the meeting began. Victoria glanced briefly toward the documents, still aligned neatly at the center of the table, then back at Marcus. There is something else, she said. Marcus waited. This morning, she continued, her voice steady, but quieter now. It was not just an assumption. The words paused there, not incomplete, but deliberate. Marcus did not interrupt. Victoria finished the thought. It was a pattern. The admission did not come with explanation. It did not come with defense. It simply existed. Marcus's gaze remained steady, not shifting, not softening, just present. Yes, he said. There was no elaboration. There did not need to be. The acknowledgement was enough. Victoria's fingers pressed lightly against the table, not tense, not rigid, just aware of the surface beneath them. Then changing process is not enough, she said. Marcus leaned back slightly, his posture returning to stillness. It never is, he replied. Victoria nodded slowly, the movement grounded in understanding rather than reaction. Then I changed the pattern, she said. Marcus watched her for a moment, not evaluating the statement, but the intent behind it. Patterns do not change because you decide they should, he said. Victoria held his gaze. Then they change because I see them, she replied. The words were quiet, but they held. Marcus's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not approval, not satisfaction, but something closer to acknowledgement of alignment. That is the first step, he said. The room remained steady, the conversation no longer carrying tension, but direction, something that moved forward without needing force. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, lights steady, movement constant, unaware of the shift that had taken place inside this room. And inside, where control had once defined every decision, something else had taken root, something quieter, something harder to measure, something that did not demand authority to exist, but changed everything once it was seen. The room had grown quieter, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been placed on the table, and now it was no longer about speaking. It was about what would be carried forward when the words were no longer present. Victoria remained still for a moment, her hands resting lightly against the surface, her posture no longer defined by control or correction, but by something steadier, something that did not need to prove itself to exist. Across from her, Marcus sat with the same calm presence, his gaze steady, not pressing, not withdrawing, simply there, as it had been from the beginning, as if the entire path to this moment had always been within his reach. The documents between them remained untouched, their purpose complete, their weight now internal rather than physical. Victoria glanced at them briefly, then closed the folder in front of her with a soft, deliberate motion, aligning the edges carefully, not out of habit, but out of respect for what they represented. There is one more step, she said, her voice even, grounded, not searching for direction, but acknowledging it. Marcus did not respond immediately. He watched her, allowing the statement to stand on its own. Before asking, "Which one?" Victoria lifted her gaze to meet his. "Ownership is not just legal," she said. "It is visible." Marcus's expression did not change, but his attention sharpened slightly, recognizing the shift in her framing. "Go on," he said. Victoria took a slow breath, not to steady herself, but to align her words with her understanding. "This company has operated under a perception," she continued, "one that I reinforced." She did not pause to soften it. She did not redirect it. She let it exist as it was. Marcus inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the clarity without interrupting it. "Then that perception changes," she said. Marcus leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, but his focus precise. "How?" he asked. Victoria did not look at the documents this time. She looked at him. "It starts with visibility," she said. "Not statements. Not announcements. Presence." The words settled into the room with quiet weight. Marcus watched her for a moment, then asked, "Whose presence?" Victoria did not hesitate. "Yours," she said. The answer did not come as a concession. It came as recognition. The room held still around them, the meaning of the statement expanding without needing explanation. Marcus remained silent for a moment, not because he was surprised, but because he understood the weight of what she was proposing. "That changes more than optics," he said finally. Victoria nodded once. "It should," she replied. The exchange did not escalate. It did not need to. It moved forward with a quiet certainty that had replaced everything that came before it. Victoria leaned slightly forward, her hands resting flat on the table, her posture aligned with intention rather than authority. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "executive briefing. Full staff invited. No filtering. No hierarchy in the room." Marcus listened without interrupting. "And?" he asked. Victoria held his gaze. "You speak," she said. Marcus's eyes remained steady on hers, not rejecting the idea, but examining it from a place deeper than position. "And you?" he asked. Victoria did not look away. "I listened," she said. The words were simple, but they carried a shift that could not be undone. Marcus nodded once, slowly, the movement measured, acknowledging not just the plan, but the intention behind it. "That is where change becomes visible," he said. Victoria exhaled quietly, the breath not carrying tension, but release, as if something that had been held in place too long had finally been allowed to move. The room remained still, but the stillness no longer felt like waiting. It felt like alignment. Outside, the city lights continued to hold steady, each one distinct, each one part of a system that functioned because it was seen, because it was acknowledged. Inside the room, the same principle had begun to take shape, not as theory, not as structure, but as action. Victoria rose from her seat, not abruptly, not ceremonially, just a natural movement that marked the transition from conversation to execution. Marcus remained seated for a moment longer, watching her, not to measure, not to confirm, but to recognize that something real had shifted. Victoria gathered the folder from the table and held it lightly at her side, then looked back at him. "This does not undo what happened," she said. Marcus met her gaze. "No," he replied. Victoria nodded once. "But it defines what happens next," she added. Marcus stood then, his movement smooth, unhurried, aligning with hers without mirroring it. "That is the only part that can change," he said. The two of them stood across from each other, no longer divided by assumption, no longer defined by position, but connected by something quieter, something that did not need to be spoken again to remain present. Victoria moved toward the door and paused with her hand on the handle, not hesitating, but acknowledging the moment before it passed. "Tomorrow," she said. Marcus inclined his head slightly. "Tomorrow," he replied. She opened the door, and the soft sound of it broke the stillness, not as an ending, but as a continuation, as the next step moved into place without resistance, without delay, and without the need to be announced. The morning arrived without announcement, the city already in motion before the sun had fully settled into the sky, light stretching across glass and steel and long, quiet lines that reflected more than just buildings. It reflected presence, structure, and everything that moved within it. Inside Hale Tower, the executive floor no longer carried its usual rhythm. There was a subtle shift in the way people walked, in the way conversations paused instead of flowed, as if something unspoken had already reached them before any official word had been given. The conference room doors stood open, not as an invitation, but as a signal that the space inside was no longer reserved for a select few. Chairs filled slowly, not by hierarchy, but by arrival, employees from different levels, different departments, different parts of the system taking their place without instruction, without direction, guided only by the understanding that something different was happening. Victoria stood near the front of the room, not behind the table, not elevated, but level with everyone else, her posture aligned, her presence steady, no longer defined by distance. She watched as the room filled, her eyes moving across faces she had seen before, but never truly registered, each one now distinct, each one part of the structure she had once believed she fully controlled. There was no announcement, no formal opening, just a quiet settling of people into space, the low sound of chairs shifting, papers being placed down, breath aligning into a shared stillness that did not feel forced. Then the door at the far end opened, and Marcus Reed stepped inside. He did not rush. He did not pause for attention. He simply entered, and the room adjusted to him in the same quiet way it had before, not through command, but through presence. Conversations faded without instruction. Movement slowed without direction. He walked forward, not to the center, not to a stage, but to a place where he could be seen without standing above anyone else. Victoria met his gaze briefly, not as a signal, not as a cue, just acknowledgement, then stepped back half a pace, creating space without announcing it. Marcus looked out across the room, not scanning, not evaluating, simply seeing, his eyes moving from one face to another, holding each one for just long enough to recognize it as part of something larger. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, held, shared. When he spoke, his voice did not rise. It did not need to. Yesterday, he said, something happened in a parking lot. The words were simple, direct, but they carried the weight of a moment everyone in the room had already heard about, whether through message, through rumor, or through the subtle shift in the building itself. Marcus did not elaborate immediately. He let the words settle, not for effect, but for clarity. It was not about a car, he continued. It was about what we assume before we understand. The room remained still, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer passive. It was engaged. Marcus's gaze moved across the room again, not searching for reaction, but recognizing presence. This company does not fail because of what we do not know, he said. It fails because of what we believe without checking. The words did not accuse. They did not isolate. They included. Victoria stood at the side, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture aligned with the room rather than above it. And she did not interrupt, did not redirect, did not reclaim the moment. She listened. Around the room, small shifts occurred, not visible in large movements, but in the way people held themselves, in the way attention deepened, in the way something unspoken began to align across different levels of the same structure. Marcus paused, allowing the silence to hold again, then continued. Ownership is not a title, he said. It is what you choose to see responsibility for. The words settled into the room with quiet precision, not demanding agreement, but inviting recognition. Victoria's gaze lowered slightly, not in avoidance, but in reflection, the statement aligning with something she had already begun to understand. Marcus did not move closer. He did not raise his voice. He simply remained where he was, his presence steady, his words measured. This building has always had the information it needed, he said. What it did not have was attention. The distinction landed clearly, not as criticism, but as truth. A few people shifted in their seats, not uncomfortably, but in awareness, the kind that cannot be undone once it arrives. Victoria lifted her gaze again, her eyes moving across the room, not scanning, but seeing, and for the first time, she did not try to organize what she saw into structure. She allowed it to exist as it was. Marcus's voice softened slightly, not in volume, but in tone. That changes today, he said. Not because I say it does, but because you choose to see differently. The words did not close the moment. They opened it. He stepped back slightly, not leaving, not ending, but making space, the same way she had done moments before, the movement small, but significant. The room did not respond with applause. It did not break into discussion. It held the silence, not out of uncertainty, but out of understanding that something real had shifted, something that did not need to be, filled with noise to be acknowledged. Victoria remained where she was, her posture steady, her presence grounded, and for the first time, she did not step forward to conclude, to summarize, or to control the outcome. She allowed the moment to exist without framing it. And in that stillness, where authority once spoke first and listened last, something else had taken its place, something quieter, something stronger, something that did not announce itself, but changed everything it touched. He did not raise his voice. She did not interrupt. And the room did not forget.